and even, oh, good to know. And then even, you know, Cornelius Fredericks, which is the Black boy who was restrained recently at a juvenile facility for throwing a sandwich and being knelt on until he lost consciousness and eventually died, right? And I don't say that to be voyeuristic. I say it because we constantly want to be saying the names of the people who we have lost to white supremacy and anti-Black violence, and really recognizing all of those contours. I think this onslaught of Black death along with COVID, right, that these two things are happening at once and in this way that is so deeply interconnected, it's much harder to look away. It's also harder to look away because people are juggling all these things with the pandemic, but they are at home and suddenly they're having time to engage. And that that's not an excuse for people who are just engaging now, but I think there's just something about the current moment that is, maybe the pandemic is kind of jolting us out of the everydayness of of anti-Black violence, and it's pushing us to recognize these other ways that it's coming about. And one of the things I hope we can always do is recognize both this really massive violence, right, that we are seeing with these killings, but also then like the everyday kind of what Nirmala Aravallis calls the dislocation, right? The dislocation of pulling people through less physically violent practices, but still pulling people away from participating in life in particular ways. So I think that there's just a whole bunch of things that are happening right now, and that the inequities that have always been there are being so exacerbated by the pandemic that you have to have your head completely buried to not be waking up in this moment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this question is one that leaves me still in a process. You know, I didn't initially have anything to add because I'm just appreciative of the thoughtfulness that Subini offered around the question. The part of the question that is probably the most, I don't want to say triggering, but the part that resonates or sits with me is, why do you think these recent deaths spurred such public engagement among white people? What's different, if anything? And so, you know, part of me, when I heard the question, I thought to myself, what's different for me, if anything, or what's different for them? Right? So it, you know, similar to the first question, that we have to be in agreement about how we're entering into are we in agreement about what we're seeing, right? And so my thoughts about this, how to answer this question, are still coming together, because for me, what's different, if anything, I'm sitting with what's different for me as a Black person who is experiencing this great loss, who's outraged completely by it and brokenhearted by it. So, you know, so I have nothing more to add to the comments that have already been shared.
But I think the grief that you're expressing is so deep for us, and I appreciate you recentering us in this conversation about what's different for them versus what's different for us, because I think that is really, really important, is to understand that we, Black folks in particular, Indigenous folks in particular, Latinx folks to some degree, and Asian folks for other reasons, are experiencing such grief right in this moment, while we're dealing with the violence and we're dealing with doing all the other things everyone else is doing.
And I if I could reinforce what you're saying by further stating that I'm grappling with that very little is different for me, and the weight of that prevents me from engaging in how this is different for you. Mm-hmm. I'm too busy. Right. There's more important work to do, mm-hmm. to think about me and my communities. Mm-hmm. So that's why I don't have much to add.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That resonates a lot with me. So I just want to thank you for that, Chayla. So the next question then is also for you, Chayla. So this question I think picks up a little bit from the previous one. I've in talking with many of my Black colleagues and friends in education, some of the common element that they've raised is that they've had a lot more of their white friends and colleagues reaching out to them to check in on them this summer than they've had in the past. And so on the one hand, they appreciate the reaching out, the level of care that white friends and colleagues are showing. On the other hand, it feels like it's yet another form of labor that they have to take time to respond to these texts or messages from their white colleagues and friends. And so I'm wondering if you can offer some insight about how white people can handle this tension. So more specifically, like how can white people not remain silent by showing care and empathy for their Black friends and colleagues without also further taxing them?
Yeah, this question kind of, my comments pick up where the last question kind of left off. You know, I appreciate it being here because it resonates with me and does what I think matters to Subini and myself with trying to decenter whiteness and recenter, you know, the lived experiences of Black and brown people. So I have, like many of you, I'm sure, been receiving those check-in texts and emails from white colleagues who are attempting to show me that they care. But like those Black colleagues and friends of yours, Stephen, I too feel that those check-in messages tend to recenter whiteness, especially when the tone of the message itself reinforces white innocence. And by that, I mean, my white colleague or friend is failing to acknowledge that acknowledge the racism that they also benefit from, which is only exacerbated by the fact that their reaching out feels like it's coming just a bit too late. So as a result, those check-in text messages and emails that I've received from white colleagues have gone unacknowledged because I'm in a space where I'm trying to protect my own energies and resting in my own silence as an act of resistance. But if I were trying to offer something to white people looking for recommendations of how to handle the tension, and more importantly, how to show up and demonstrate care and empathy for their Black colleagues and friends, I would have to defer to one of the most dopest, illest Black women scholars that I know. I'm sure you all might know her as well, Dr. Natasha Crum. She, like many other Black scholars and activists, have been speaking out, giving Black folks like me who may be brokenhearted and outraged, exhausted by whiteness, the language they need in these moments. And so she writes in part in a Facebook post dated May 31st, thought, before you check on your Black colleagues, maybe do some deep reflection on all the ways you showed up in prior to this moment as racist, white supremacist, anti-Black, misogynistic, and in horizontal hostilities, because we haven't forgotten. And I promise you, your email or program isn't going to make us forget. It's likely going to make us want to hold you more accountable for your lack of change behavior and harm. And so I wish I had that language. I wanted to hit, as soon as I saw the post, I thought, this is almost how I should have responded to the text that I got. And honestly, I think what Dr. Crum is attempting to echo is and encourage that white folks sit with that tension, that is part of the work, and that you have to come to terms with the anti-Blackness, you know, the white supremacists, the racists within first, right? Before you attempt to show up, and we'll be able to tell if you hadn't, right? So how do you do that? And so I think that's the first step in at least acknowledging that I'm certain that I've shown up prior to this moment in our interactions as racist, white supremacist, anti-Black. I'm certain of it, you know, so there needs to be that acknowledgement first in the interaction as a way to sit with the tension. That is a way of sitting with the tension. And I think had
Right. I just want to add that, yeah, I put up something sarcastic when that happened. It was like, stop looking through your Black friends Rolodex, you know, and reaching back. Some of y'all, I mean, I was getting messages from people I went to grade school with, like, you know, like folks who I have not talked to in years. That is not who you should be reaching out to and asking them if they're safe being vulnerable with you. Right. And that to me, that it speaks to everything. And it actually is more violence. Asking your Black friends to bleed on the page for you, or to tell you how they're experiencing this moment when you have never asked them before, is inappropriate. And right. The thing is, there's so much work out there. Google is your friend. Not Google the company, Google the action. Like Google it, do it, you know, on whatever little search engine you want. And then I would also, just in support of what Professor Haynes Davison is saying, is really making sure that our commitments aren't surface level commitments. So yes, I'm glad y'all read White Fragility, but for every time you say white fragility, which is just about your feelings and not about systemic racism and systemic anti-Blackness, we need something more than that. That isn't going to do it. I'm not saying don't read it. I'm saying don't stop there. So every time you hear someone reference white fragility, I challenge you to read They Were Her Property by Stephanie Jones Rogers. Read something by Zeus Leonardo, who studied whiteness for years. Read something by Cheryl Matias, who studies whiteness and white educators. Right? There are many folks of color and folks doing this critical work. But like They Were Her Property, right, is about white women who owned slaves, because so often the narrative around slave holding is, oh, it was the men that did it and women were just, but it's actually a very clear example of how white women uphold white supremacy in that time. And so again, really understanding that that would be a powerful alternative, that some of this other work would also would move us from your feelings and white fragility as a concept that's about how we feel into a much more substantive conversation about systemic racism and how we hold up systemic white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And that moves us away from feeling so much. Because really, honestly, frankly, to tell you the truth, white folks writ large, I'm not interested in your feelings. Lots of folks aren't. Your feelings, you being hurt or uncomfortable is not as important as the people's names who we read who have been killed, or the folks who are being dehumanized and dispossessed in so many other ways. And that's what I think really needs to come through. That if you're going to expect this kind of heart-wrenching conversation from me, if I'm going to give it to you, I'm certainly not going to be worried about how I make you feel.
Right. And that is because we understand how whiteness works, right?
Exactly.
So we're trying to decenter it.
Exactly.
So, yes. And part of that tension that white folks would need to sit with is the acknowledgement that it's not about you. So if you're reaching out to a Black person to say, I'm concerned about how you to offer your care and concern, it can't be about you. So, to have an email or a text message go unacknowledged, that needs to be okay, right, with you. And if it's not okay with you, then you've recentered whiteness, right? You've recentered yourself in Black suffering and Black pain, made it about you. So yeah, do you have the can you walk circumspectly, right? Do you have the consciousness about that, about how you're showing up in the conversation? Right. And the person who would enter the conversation in the ways that Dr. Kroom suggests, you can at least suspect that they have given some thought about how they might show up in the conversation.
Thank you both. One of the things that I'm I'm hearing as both of you are speaking, and it goes back to one of the very first things that you said, Subini, was this notion of like white people having humility. And so I keep coming back to that comment because I think what you're saying, Chayla, around like when white folks are able to acknowledge and sit with the tension that you've named, like that represents a certain level of humility that I think is really important in these conversations. So I'm just reminded of that, and I just wanted to reinforce that as well.
Yeah, and if I can just mention that, so we write about this in a piece we have, but so W.E.B. Du Bois writes about this something called gift theory. And Raylan Rabaka, who's a W.E.B. Du Bois scholar from the University of Colorado Boulder, writes about this gift theory. And this idea is basically that along with second sight, which is understanding white folks kind of better than they understand themselves, understanding how Black folks are positioned within systems of oppression, it's also understanding that that knowledge is a gift that we hold, and we understand the system better than white folks ever will. Because we both have to understand our own role in it and their role, the whiteness's role in it. So if we understand that as a gift, and white folks can start to understand that Black folks actually have knowledge that they don't have, that takes humility, because y'all have been told over and over and over that you're the exceptional ones, and that you're the ones, that you're the norm that we should all be striving to. But what if you actually admitted that there's things we know that you do not know? And that you actually have to listen and move through that, and you have to do it with humility. And we write about it as white educators, and educators have to do it in relationship to their students. And that's real hard for folks, because educators have been told that they have all the answers, right? And they've been told that as adults, they have so much more information than their students. But what really comes down to, think about how your relationships change when you enter with humility. And how when you listen with humility, it can remove your defensiveness. So that idea, like I said, comes back from W.E.B. Du Bois to Raylan Rabaka, and something that we've built on over time.
Thank you. So this is a good segue into, I want to talk about some of both of your work. So I mean, you've written on this topic, and so let's spend some time talking a little bit about that. So we'll start with you, Chayla. So one of the things that you and Lori Patton recently published was an article in Change magazine titled "Dear White People, Reimagining Whiteness in the Struggle for Racial Equity." So I'm wondering if you can give the listeners today, a primer on some of the key points that you raised in the article related to whiteness and anti-Blackness in education, and then more specifically, how do you articulate white people's role in challenging anti-Blackness?
So, this article was published at a time where there was heightened public engagement around what can white people be doing, and that's when the calls from white people were coming in to ask to the check-ins. So this article came out at that time. And so we didn't plan it that way. It was something that we were writing, and it just got released at the time. And so in our article, we invite white people into what we believe is an honest conversation about whiteness, their whiteness. And we use Derek Bell's piece, A White Leader, Able to Free Whites from Racism, as food for thought. And while Dr. Patton and I do not see it as our role to tell white people how to unlearn whiteness, we offer a perspective on the topic as Black women who contend with its ugliness every day. So in the article, we start off by deconstructing 3 truths about whiteness. And for us, we articulate them this way in terms of the truths about whiteness: that whiteness resists the undoing of itself, that whiteness is not invisible but hypervisible, and whiteness is imperfection. And we deconstruct these truths to help white people reimagine whiteness and understand how it contributes to the everyday acts of anti-Blackness and systemic racism that Black people experience in education and society. And so throughout the article, we point white people to the ways that they can assume responsibility for dismantling whiteness and challenging anti-Blackness, which we posit involves white people doing self-work of interrogating their whiteness and being capable of responding to racial injustice in actionable ways, while also engaging white people in these processes as non-negotiable imperatives. And so that's the long and short of it. But we see these as non-negotiable imperatives, this idea of doing self-work, being able to and being capable of responding to racial injustice in actionable ways and engaging white people in the work. We see those things as non-negotiable imperatives because, after all, Derek Bell asserts that if white people's love and respect for Black people is genuine, then they should be able to imagine and work in solidarity with us to create a stable society without using Black suffering as a societal glue. So that's the long and the short of the article in itself, and it's just a conversation that we try to lay out for white folks who are just looking for a starting point. And it kind of, you know, reinforces what Subini talked about in the last question about that second sight. You know, we have we understand how whiteness shapes our life, has shaped our life. So we offer you some truths that you may be unaware of or have been told that they don't exist. So here's some truths about whiteness that you need to acknowledge and understand and accept as true. They're not imagined by us as Black people, Black women in particular. These are realities, so that you can assume your own responsibility in dismantling of white supremacy and whiteness.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. The only thing I would add is, like, always reminding not to recenter white people, because that is never my goal, and I want to just keep making that clear, not to recenter whiteness, but white supremacy hurts white folks. Yeah, like I think that's something that has to be said, because y'all can reclaim your own humanity. When you engage in this work, because you have been taught to ignore Black suffering, Black death, violent, anti-Black violence, because that is how white supremacy keeps moving forward.
Right.
And so if you recognize, when you start to recognize our humanity, you start to put a piece of yourself back that white supremacy has taken. So I just wanted to add that, but everything else Chayla says, I absolutely co-sign, of course. And that article was fabulous, and it was such a pleasure to read, and I can promise I emailed it to lots of people.
Thank you.
Subini, you just said something that I wanted to follow up on. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on the point you raised. You said white supremacy hurts white people. And I think that's something that I don't know if many white folks see or know the ways that it does. And so I'm wondering if you could share, what are some ways or examples in your mind of how white supremacy hurts white people?
I mean, I immediately think of children. I'm an educator and I'm a high school teacher, and that's where, like, kind of my points of knowledge always move from. But, you know, when we see, I mean, there's so many examples, right? Like, it's almost hard to, but like, white mediocrity being rewarded does not make you excellent. It just makes you mediocrity being rewarded, right? And so, so that's something to think about. But also, when white folks lose compassion. So yesterday, here's a great example. So yesterday, there was a story that came out on ProPublica about a Black girl with ADHD who did not finish her homework, her online homework during the pandemic, right? And because of this, a judge in Michigan decided that she was in violation of her probation and sent her to a youth prison for not completing her homework. Her boring homework during an online virtual learning during a pandemic. And some of the comments, most of them, of course, were outraged, as they should be, but there were comments that were like, well, you didn't follow the rules of your probation, so there you go. That is a lack of humanity. When you cannot see that a child should not be incarcerated, first of all, for any reason, let's go there, but second of all, for not finishing your homework during a pandemic. When you have lost that kind of empathy, that is damage. That is hurt. That is a problem. And that is how do I want to say it? Not a symptom, but it is part of white supremacy, is that you have been conditioned to not see the humanity. It's like how, you know, when we see movies and you can only relate if the character is white and does these certain things and middle class and this and that. And Black movies are Black movies, right? We don't show those to our kids and things like that. So again, when we can't see ourselves in other people, you have lost the ability to empathize, right? Y'all, I think that shows how white supremacy hurts white people. There are a million examples of it, but that's just one.
Thank you. That was helpful.
So in a piece, so how I understand this idea of how whiteness harms white people, it makes me think about the ways in which we engage in the struggle together. It's not just for my liberation, but it's for your liberation too. There's something for you in this, right? And so in a piece that I did is called A Message for Faculty from the Present Day Movement for Black Lives. We spend a lot of time talking about how whiteness, the properties of whiteness enact anti-Blackness, and then in what ways does it harm Black folks in particular, but make white people culpable in that harm. You know, so, you know, one of the things we say, you know, anti-Blackness condones the surveilling of Black bodies, you know, anti-Blackness signals to colonial imaginations that Black people remain property and Black bodies are opportunities for domination. Anti-Blackness indulges, as Subini already mentioned, in white mediocrity, white fragility, and white antagonism as represented in the racist behaviors of many Black folks, especially in the situation that Subini mentioned regarding the young Black girl who essentially was criminalized for not doing her homework. And so, you know, anti-Blackness holds that Black people are not victims. So it makes you culpable and complicit in the harm. It makes you the perpetrator. So these are the ways. So if you want to be liberated from that, you need to be engaged in undoing anti-Blackness too. So these are the ways in which, and how I understand it and construct it, how Black people, how white people can have some liberation and be liberated by engaging in the dismantling of anti-Blackness too.
Thank you for those examples. Those are helpful. Subini, you didn't realize it, but you provided a good segue actually with sharing that story about the Black girl who was put in prison for not completing her homework with a recent book that you have on the subject around the criminalization of girls of color. And so the question for you then is, in your recent book, The Pedagogy of Pathologization, let me say that slowly, disabled girls of color in the school prison nexus, you discuss issues such as criminalization in schools and its disproportionate effect on girls of color. So broadly speaking, how does criminalization happen in educational processes? And then more specifically, what are some key ways to make these criminalization processes more visible in an effort to address larger structures of anti-Blackness?
Thank you. Yeah, the example yesterday I think was absolutely on. It was one of the more clear examples, right? But the way criminalization happens, what I found so I worked in this book. I worked with 10 girls, mainly Black girls, but girls of color in a maximum security youth prison, right? And so first of all, I want us to understand what youth prisons are. Because I think when we hear youth incarceration, youth detention, a lot of times there's euphemistic names like youth camp, or we're just sending them to the Learning Academy. But youth prisons are prisons. And I want to be really clear that when we send kids to prison, we take away all of their access to their families, to their communities, to the resources they have, and we send them to a place that is committed to misunderstanding them. And when I say committed to misunderstanding them, I mean committed to seeing their problems as only theirs. The deficit lays inside themselves. That is how the narrative is. And one of the ways they do that is particular discourses, right? First of all, it's very color evasive or race evasive. And I use that word as an alternative to colorblind, right? For one reason, because it's ableist, and blindness actually, it's associating blindness with ignorance, when we actually know blindness actually blind folks have ways of knowing that sighted people have no access to. So they know things we don't know. Again, that humility. But also because color blindness can assume a passiveness. Oh, I just didn't see it. It wasn't there. And what it really is an evasion of talking about race. It's a way to sustain power and sustain white supremacy. So if you are finding yourself not being able to say the word black people, Black girls, right? We need to really talk about that. So first of all, just to kind of back up, we have a paper on that called Conceptualizing Color Evasiveness, just because I keep seeing people asking for information in the chat. So that's one thing. But so one of the things we saw was, or what I saw in this youth prison, and again, when I say youth prison, I mean maximum security, locks on every door. Girls have to walk all in, uniforms, have to walk through the halls with their hands behind their back, are wanded, and I mean wanded, metal detectored in and out of every single class they go to. If a pencil goes missing, they are strip searched. So I really want you to sit with the sexual violence and the gendered violence that happens in youth prisons, where tools of learning are considered weapons. So when we sit with that, we have to start thinking about whether or not we're comfortable with that for any child. And then when you start realizing that the majority of kids who are in there are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous, they're also often queer or gender nonconforming. They're also often disabled, right? So we're starting to see that it is, youth prisons are, what I always say is they're like a microcosm. They're an exacerbation of every inequity that you see in society is worse in youth prisons. They're almost always, most of those kids are poor. They don't have money for good defense lawyers, all that stuff. So when we wonder what role schools play, one of the examples is what happened, the report that came out yesterday, where the teacher actually said, listen, this girl is doing as best as she can. She's doing what everyone else is doing, but it was the structure of schooling was still used as a reason to lock her up. So there's that. But then there's also more direct ways that schools play in criminalizing youth. So from things like when I was a teacher, which, starting to be a long time ago. But when I was a teacher, we were encouraged. Encouraged meant it wasn't written down, but we were supposed to do it. When the tardy bell rang, we were supposed to lock our door or close our classroom doors, and then police would come in and do hall sweeps. The SROs would go they would do hall sweeps. They would round up all the kids and they would give them tickets for trespassing. So something really direct. And then other much more indirect things, right? Suspensions. When we decide we're going to kick kids out of class, we know that increases the likelihood they're going to drop out and be in contact with the juvenile justice system. And we should call it the juvenile legal system because there's really no justice there. So and then also special education designation. We also know that special education has a lot to do with who is getting their suspended more than their non-disabled peers, Black youth in particular. We know that those kids often, when they get into special ed, right, a special ed label for a Black child is more likely used to segregate them, where a special education label for a white child is more likely they're going to be in class with their peers who aren't labeled disabled, getting support. So they get that segregate. We justify segregation versus on disability. And then we are more likely to give them remedial work. And I mean remedial work. So I can, again, an example from when I was a high school teacher was that students were often, I had a student, Jermaine, who was still doing place value as a sophomore in high school. Still doing place value work. Now, can you imagine you're in high school and you're still learning where to put the decimal point? Like, do we really need to do that, or can we give them a calculator and let them move on, right? And we're having kids do these kind of, Sassy the Seal kind of readings instead of any kind of meaningful literacy that is connected to their lives. So we get we get reductive curriculum, we get problematic relationships that were often based on surveillance, right? Point sheets, things like that. And then they get pedagogy that is weak. It's often worksheets and things like that. So once we start deciding kids are too difficult for us to handle, and again, we push them out of kind of the general view, put them in segregated classrooms, and then do this kind of thing, and then wonder why they don't want to come to school. So again, multiple ways that we kind of criminalize kids. What I'm trying to get at is the criminalization of kids isn't a one-time deal. A lot of times it's a slow, debilitating process that forecloses access to academic and classroom life.
Prolonged exposure.
Prolonged exposure, that's a beautiful way to put it.
So let's stick with another question for you, Subini, that I wanted to get in here. So in many of my conversations with racially minoritized colleagues, they explicitly express that rather than focusing on educating white people, they focus more intently on promoting Black liberation. So how might people of color listening navigate an academic terrain in which their commitment to Black lives inherently conflicts with expectations of them to educate white people?
Right. I don't know. I was joking that I got invited to this panel because I went on another Facebook rant, which is like kind of my, or a Twitter rant, because I like to do those at the same time. But I had said, one of the things I've recently posted is that and I said it already here, is that my audience isn't white folks who are just learning the work. My audience is not, I am not good at racism 101. Some people are, and bless them for doing that work, because it's got to get done, but it's not my gift, right? So part of it is knowing that and being able to then write to the people who I'm centering. So I continually say I center Black and brown folks, and in particular, who are writing about race but maybe don't understand connections with ableism and disability, and really trying to reclaim that language and reclaim disability as not, instead of a deficit identity, which is what a lot of people imagine it as, to understand it as a social and political identity with a history of political resistance, right? And that shifts that conversation. But because I know that, I think my writing is more powerful. I'm not trying to reach everyone. Now, can I say in academia, like when I'm in my classes, I can't say I'm not here to teach you. Obviously, that's not the conversation, right? With the students in my classes, I'm very clear, and I absolutely am there to teach them, and I absolutely will meet them where they're at, but I also hold very high expectations. And I've been punished for as such, right? With student evals that we know are biased to women, to people of color. And I say that specifically because very few focus on Black women and our experiences in the classroom, but we know that we're getting doubly punished for being Black and women. And we know we're getting punished for teaching about race and racism. I have, in other teacher ed programs and I've worked in more than one, where the message is, we already got this in our diversity class. Why are you talking about race here, right? So again, really understanding A, who my audience is when I write, and then B, making sure that my superiors understand that the people in administration, that the folks who have the power understand the things that I work, the kind of constraints that I work within, and also building those relationships so collegially, like making sure that I have other folks who understand that, who are at my rank and higher, and for those with my rank and below, we can also think about forming together to make these arguments, so it's not a one-on-one, a one-off, like here's my case and that's only I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how do I make this situation more productive for all of us who are coming up behind me. So I'm trying to always look to the people who have the power and trying to get them to understand what we need, and also hold the door open for folks. And we do that by building together and being collaborative as much as we can, and making sure that we protect each other.
Thank you. All right, so we're gonna open it to questions from the audience in about 10 minutes or so. So I just wanted you to leave listeners, before we get to questions from the audience, with what is one takeaway or point that you want in particular white listeners to know before we open it up for questions? And why don't we start with you, Chayla?
So it's hard to limit to just one. But what I will say is that just be reminded that there are multiple properties of whiteness that maintenance white supremacy and ultimately enact anti-Blackness. And so interrogating whiteness starts with first thinking about how whiteness shapes your life. And I always add some parentheticals around that: shapes your life, your teaching, your research, your interactions with students. Be reminded that purposeful conversations about whiteness do not have to be formal, that they should be taking place in your workplace, in your church, in your communities, in your interactions with other white parents, at your kids' school, at home with your spouse, with your children, your siblings, your grandparents. So these are things that interrogating whiteness should be something, they don't have to be formal. It should be something you're engaged in your own, so that you come into intimate understanding about how whiteness is shaping your own life.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like the things that we've already suggested. There's a whole bunch, right? That critical listening with humility. I mean, I'm kind of keeping an eye on the chat over here, and somebody says, why are you in this session if you don't believe that we should center white people? And it's because y'all impact us, you know, like, so this idea that you're not always going to be the center of my conversations doesn't mean that I can't ever have a conversation with white folks about what they can be doing better. So let's kind of not play that game of like, you have to be here and there's only one way to understand the world. I think we need to have more complex conversations, but I think they really can't happen if you're not listening with critical humility. So that's going to be the thing I'm going to continually encourage, is that if you want to approach these conversations, it's not the time to play devil's advocate. It's not the time to get cute with your language. It's the time to listen with care and concern and critical reflection. It's the time to actually think about, how am I upholding these? How can I get engaged in this? How can I rethink this? There's an issue I see. Mariama Kaba has some really great questions. She blogs, or she's on Twitter under the handle @PrisonCulture. And she's an abolitionist who's been doing this work as an organizer for years. And she's got this list of questions, and I'm not going to get it right. So I'm just going to encourage you to go there because it's her pinned tweet. And but when you get interested in an idea, it's who's already doing this work. Don't suddenly, the amount of times recently that I've gotten an email saying, we've decided to put together a group. And I just say, well, before you put together a group, maybe look and see who's doing the work and what help they already need. Just because you just woke up doesn't mean the rest of us haven't been here having that fight already. So I just want to really encourage, like, again, that's where that humility comes from. We don't need you to save us. We need y'all to save yourselves. So just think of it that way, and it really moves the conversation differently.
Well, thank you both for your labor and time in offering those responses to these questions. And so I want to open it up now for a number of questions that have come as you both have been speaking. So I'm going to do my best to get to as many of these as possible. And where possible, I'll try to group ones that I feel are related together. And so why don't we start with a question that somebody asked earlier in the conversation around, the question is, how can white people enter into public academic spaces doing the work of breaking down white supremacy and not allow academic systems to highlight our voices, meaning white people's voices, over the voices of people of color who have been doing this work for centuries? And I think you've been getting at that a lot throughout this session. Both Chayla and Subini, I think, have been really intentional of naming specific authors of color, particularly women of color. And I think that's one way to do that. So what do you think about that question? Like, what are ways that white people can engage this work without further highlighting their own voices over the voices of people of color?
Are you pointing to me?
I need to learn.
Well, I definitely think, I appreciate social media followings and handles such as Cite a Sister, where they're encouraging you, and the work that the African American Policy Forum is doing around Say Her Name, because civil rights movements, Black liberation movements in particular, are really rooted in the labor of Black women right? The intellectual property of Black women. And so, yes, go back to these original sources and look for the folks who have been already engaged in this work for generations. But I do say, I often get the question, because a strand of my research is really about white faculty and thinking about white racial consciousness and using CRT to get to these places, and particularly, you know, exploring what do white people perceive their role to be in this work. So I often get the question around that, and how I tend to respond is rooted in my last comment about you have to be aware of how whiteness shapes your life, because, you know, I ask that question in mixed company when I go do any type of presentation or engage with faculty or colleagues. So tell me, have a conversation with your neighbor about how whiteness shapes your life. It's not only white people in that room, but it tends to be that white people are less familiar with the ways that whiteness is shaping their life. So what I might offer to the person who posed this question about, okay, so how do I not recenter whiteness if my intent is to dismantle? So yes, look at the scholars and activists and organizers who have already been in this work, and don't co-opt it, right? But use it to inform and center these perspectives and say their names. But also, close kin to that, second to that, is before you open your mouth, you have to be aware and evaluate the ways in which whiteness is upheld, protected, and rewarded in your discipline, in the work that we do. Nothing is apolitical or ahistorical or race neutral. So if you understand how whiteness works and the properties of whiteness, or the truths that, you know, for example, that Dr. Patton and I situate in that one article, if you are aware of that, then it's your duty to assume that responsibility and start really dealing with and confronting and coming to grips with the ways that whiteness is upheld, protected, and rewarded in your work. That's, if you aren't aware, then you thereby are complicit in enacting anti-Blackness in your own classroom, in your interactions with students, in your interactions with colleagues, in your tenure review process, in your. So you have to be aware of those things first before you open your mouth, because if you are aware, then you may make some different pedagogical choices. You may make some different choices along the way and how you show up in the work. That would be a great, you know, white people would be doing a whole bunch for me if they did that, right? To really become aware about in your curriculum. Are you aware about the ways in which whiteness is upheld in your own curriculum, right? Let's start there. And then if you're not aware, how can you disrupt it? So
these questions are so important, right? And thank you, Chayla, for centering them. I would just add, there are really small things you can do, right? Particularly in, you know, white folks, as you become more aware of this, you might start asking and speak on things. Okay, can you ask if there's any black folks who are speaking on this? Can you ask what they're getting paid? Can you make sure that when we get invites, we're getting paid at least as much as everyone else? Can you, when you get invited to be a center fellow or something else, you can constantly be asking, well, if I'm going to, can we also bring this person in? So we can continually think about the ways that we can, again, that's that redistribution. What if you actually said, no, but here's a whole list of Black and brown folks who can do that work?
So I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that, because that question, when you're coming into consciousness about the way that whiteness operates, I would assert that a white person is asking themselves, who am I to do this work? Am I the person who should be doing this? Because if you kind of consider the way that whiteness is rewarded, protected, and upheld, and how you yourself, even though you have this great concern to be part of the struggle and you can identify and you see, you may, after thinking about it, it ought not be me. Right? I ought not be the one.
Right.
In fact, there's some better people who do this better. And I'm going to leverage, as you said, like my privilege in this space to help amplify or uplift or sit back to create space. So I didn't mean to jump into your.
No, I love it because it's so
critical question is so important.
Exactly, and I think the thing is, this is where you actually have to give something up. And that's the thing. Everyone, oh, maybe I'll get a little uncomfortable and I'll read something that makes me feel sad. Maybe I'll do this. But what if I actually said, you have to give up some of your money, your power, your status, your amount of space you get to take up? I think that is really the thing we need to start thinking through.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for that. Another question that was raised that I would like to get to, so this I think gets at the notion of like, you've both been talking today about this notion of decentering whiteness. And so a question came in from a person who was wondering if you know of any organizations or mentorship opportunities for women of color in academia to navigate white dominant universities.
All I can say is there's not nearly enough. There's not nearly enough of them, right?
For sure.
And so I think of the women of color spaces that I've been a part of, they have definitely been grassroots efforts. The most impactful ones have been grassroots efforts where there was either a Black woman, for example, who took on that labor in that white, hetero, cis-normative space, cis-normative patriarchal space to create something that would be a space meant to renew and to pour into and to mentor, and to teach how to navigate or traverse these spaces, and then to encourage you to center your ideas. So going back to that last question that you asked, Subini, that, to understand your research agenda and not allow it to be co-opted, and how to, what performative whiteness looks like in the context of being a doctoral student, like breaking down that second site, right? So I will tell you that I'm extremely thankful to the grassroots efforts of those women of color and Black women who have just took it upon themselves to create those spaces, because I'm a benefactor of that. I wouldn't be here without half of that, those folks. So it's hard to, place a name with exactly one association or one space where you can find that. I think we've created those spaces in some, even our professional organizations that we are affiliated with. Like I'm affiliated with ASH, right? And ACPA and NASPA. And certainly those spaces have carved out identity-based groups that I've found myself identifying with and serving in and being involved in. So that's, I don't know if I have much more to offer there. I know at most institutions there hopefully is at least a group for, at least at Texas A&M, there is an organization for African American faculty and staff, that anyone can be a part of and can join up and find a home with other like-minded individuals, right? If they're looking for a space to be a part of. But yeah, there are just not enough of them. And one that I'm very excited, and certainly if you all have more information, I was so excited to see that, I believe it was at ASH, where Dr. Sharon Fries-Britt, right? That the Retaining Each Other group, women of color mentoring group, kind of became official. It was always there, but became official. So, these types of things, as they continue to grow, make me proud to be a Black woman in this space. And so not enough of them. That's all I can say, unfortunately. I wish I could just roll down the list, but there are just not enough of them.
I think the one other thing I would add to that, which I absolutely echo Professor Haynes Davidson's comments, but I think the one thing I would add is that in some ways we have to build our own. And that can be really, really hard and overwhelming as an early career and an emerging scholar, rising scholar. But I think also we have to constantly think about how to build our own. And because it helps not put certain, what we do, I think, really, really poorly in academia, and because it's what we do in society, in Western society, is we turn scholars into rock stars, right? And then there's the scholar rock star who does this, and the scholar rock star, and I, don't get me wrong, I will fangirl over Lori Patton Davis every day of the week, right? She's so brilliant, and I'm always so honored to be in the same realm with her, but and I'm not but at the same time, right, all of us need to recognize that folks are navigating really complex social systems in academia, and remember that we have to just start with the presumption that academia is meant, it was not only built to keep us out, it was built to create knowledge to justify killing us. Like, academia is not the panacea, you know, that folks really imagine it to be sometimes. And so if we approach academia like that, as a dangerous space, then we understand that everybody in it, every Black person in it, every queer person in it, everyone at the margin of multiple marginalizations is navigating a really dangerous space. And so we both want to admire the work they do and learn from it and be in conversation with it, and not be convinced that they have the answer that gets them there. The very first year I was a faculty member, I read the Black Academics Survival Guide of How to Win Tenure Without Losing Your Soul. And that was written because academia can be so harming to people, right? And so I just want to continually recognize that, and also say, you know, but the beautiful thing is we can build community. We've talked about it, a group of us who've been homies since we went to grad school together, talk about like horizontal mentoring and how we take care of each other and how we lift each other up, and how if I say, you know, a particular scholar's name in one of these panels, it can get picked up. So I always try to lift up the work of my homies, and the folks that I know do brilliant work and are also brilliant people. So I both want, you know, so really thinking about how you can build horizontally as well as vertically is sometimes, I think, gets ignored. And I think that's something that has a huge value.
I went ahead and put in the chat box. I hope I did that right, but I put in the chat box. So the Retaining Each Other mentoring group space at ASH is coordinated by Drs. Sharon Fries-Britt and Bridget Turner Kelly. And they also have a beautiful article by the same name that kind of talks about how they navigate and traverse these spaces and created a mentoring relationship that some of you have heard me say that has been a model for how I try to build my own relationships with not just women faculty, but also teach, you know, doctoral students about the importance of that, what the relationship, you know, between a faculty member who's really invested in your research, and you being the promising scholar that you're meant to be, what the possibilities are for those relationships. So I just think that's where I would start for someone who might be looking for a space.
And you did it correctly, Chayla. It's there.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So this will be our final question, then I'll share some comments to wrap us up. So the final question then for Chayla and Subini is, and it comes back again to this notion of decentering whiteness, which has been, I think, a common theme for today's talk. So the question is, if we are in positions of authority within the academy to create space for training, critical discussions, and curriculum change, how do we leverage that authority to decenter whiteness if our BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color, are few and white fragility is ever present in the vast majority?
The first thing that comes to my mind immediately, I'm just going to jump in here because it's the thing that's on my mind a lot right now, is what a lot of Black, Indigenous, and faculty of color are reporting is that they're now being asked to do this kind of development of their peers while they're also doing all of their other regular duties. And so I just really want us to remember that, like, you didn't hire me for that, and you didn't hire Professor Haynes Davison or Professor Quaye. That's not our jobs, right? And I mean, maybe it is. I don't know what everyone's positions are, but so much. I just really want to remind us that what we're hired for is actually our research and our teaching. And so if you want this other work, you want your faculty, and this could be at a public school as much as at an academic space or your company, if you want them to do the work, don't ask their peers to do the work without paying them any extra, without putting them in a dangerous situation. I mean, that when I'm being asked to do that work and I'm an untenured associate professor, folks are something like, you're asking me to teach people something that people find very difficult to do, as we're showing by this conversation of decentering whiteness. And folks get very offended by that. And then you're going to ask us to do that with people who then have control over our tenure files and our careers and our grant funding. That is inappropriate. There are people that do this work, right? There are, Lori's been involved with some of that work. Sean Harper's been involved with, there's actually folks who have that work, and they're Black folks that do that work. So I really encourage you not to ask your faculty members, the teachers, the people who you've hired to do other jobs, to take this on as an additional burden without paying them, without changing their title, without getting rid of the precarity that goes along with so many of us when we're being asked to do this work.
I mean, she said it, right? That part. Okay. Isn't it interesting? I don't know if this happens to you where you are, but sometimes it's also interesting when you get the blast emails, either from national associations or at your campus, and there's an area, so there's an announcement that someone is coming to campus with this area of expertise that you yourself, you're like, isn't it funny how you went all the way out there, right? And here there are some folks who have been doing this work too. So, what I often find is likely the answer is that we're being asked to do it for free as service, but they're being compensated to do it. And but then you have someone right here in your own, institution or in your department or in your program that has a national impact around these topics and things. So I think that's, but if you understand how whiteness is rewarded, then it would explain why that keeps happening, right? So you have to really be in touch with the way that whiteness works. Everybody does, so that we can disrupt it and stop it. And if I understood the original question, it has something to do with how do we decenter whiteness when whiteness is all that is around, is the majority, right? And it's just so important to understand whiteness as phenomenon. Yes, it benefits white people, but understand whiteness as phenomenon, as ideology, as system and systemic. So like, that's important too, to not get lost in the fact that, not to open a whole new can of worms, but there could be a whole bunch of people of color in a room still, and whiteness is pervasive. So we have to know how whiteness works, all of us, so that we can kind of dismantle it and know how it's going to operate and kind of anticipate it ahead of time.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our time for today. So thank you so much, Dr. Haynes Davison and Dr. Annamma, for your talent, your energy, your time, and your dedication in spending 90 minutes with us today, especially in the midst of a pandemic and everything else I'm sure you are managing in your lives. I am deeply grateful for your time and energy. So this is my applause to both of you. Thank you so much. So I had 2 jobs today, which I scored a 50% on. One was to moderate this panel. The other was to remember to hit the record button when the panel started, and I forgot to do that. So you will get we are gonna put this recording on our website, but unfortunately a part of it is going to be lost about the first 15 minutes. And so my apologies for that. But again, I want to thank both Subini and Chayla for their time today. And so I invite you to sign up for our 3rd session discussion next Wednesday, July 22nd, same time, same place, 1 p.m. Eastern, as we dig even deeper with a different set of panelists and focus on the next question, which is, dear white people, it's okay to be white, but can you also be anti-racist in educational spaces? And as a reminder, today's participants will receive an evaluation for today's session. So please do complete it and provide your feedback, which will be helpful in our final 2 dialogues this month. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation, and please take good care of yourselves and each other. And we hope you will join us next week as well. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.